Hello again, Governor of Ohio, Mr. Mike Dewine. To reintroduce myself to you and all new viewers of this channel, my name is David Roush. I am a friend of an innocent man who is on death row in your state, Mr. Keith LaMar. Today is January 21st, 2026. In 51 weeks, the state of Ohio plans to execute Keith for crimes he did not commit. I am going to send an open letter to you every week until January 13th, 2027, urging you to grant Keith full clemency and set him free. I will also read these letters to you on weekly episodes of this YouTube channel, in the hope that the American public knows about Keith and joins the cause for his liberation. I encourage people of conscience in America and throughout the world to join in Keith's cause and urge you to do the right thing. Set Keith LaMar free. In today's letter, I will review the foreword and the first 4 chapters of Keith LaMar's autobiography, Condemned. Keith's book rivals any great anecdotal study of class, race, and carceral injustice in America for its eloquence, narrative detail, and emotional power. Most importantly, it is an extremely compelling testament to his innocence. Ultimately, only God and the people directly involved in the deaths of those in question know with absolute certainty who did what to whom. The rest of us are only able to trust one side or the other, depending on the evidence they provide and how they interpret it. It is my hope that after reading Condemned with me, and with anyone else in our community who chooses to read along, you will trust Keith as confidently as I do. More broadly, however, the question of guilt or innocence is only part of this matter. Even for those we rightly believe have committed acts of horrible violence, the death penalty is fundamentally immoral. It only harms another person, however flawed that person might be. It does not bring the victims of their crimes back to life, though the victims' loved ones might think that it provides them a sense of righteous vengeance. Vengeance is a bitter fruit. This should be clear to anybody who is paying attention to the state of the world at large. Horrific cruelty is carried out in the name of vengeance on every continent, all the time. Again, vengeance brings nobody back to life. Without fail, it only sows the seeds of future horrific cruelty. For obvious reasons, the use of the death penalty on innocent people is doubly immoral. That is nothing more than state-sponsored murder. God looks with great shame on any nation or politician that commits this crime on their own people. Keith published Condemned in 2014, 25 years into his now 36 years of incarceration, most of which he has spent in solitary confinement. The pivotal event in Keith's book is the Lucasville prison uprising, a riot that took place in 1993, in which 9 men were killed. Though Keith had already been in prison for 6 years for an act of self-defense he committed at 19 years old, he was wrongfully convicted of killing the men who died in the Lucasville prison uprising and was sentenced to death. The first 4 chapters of this book are 1. Lucasville, A Brief History. 2. April 11th, 1993, Day of the Uprising. 3. Investigation, A Search for Informants. And 4. Trial, Mockery of Justice. The foreword for the book was written by Keith's now deceased friend, Dennis O'Hearn. O'Hearn was an author and professor of sociology at Binghamton University and Queen's University, Belfast. His work focused primarily on political economy, mutual aid, and the study of Ireland. Keith read and was greatly inspired by his book about the hunger strike of the Irish prisoner Bobby Sands, Nothing But an Unfinished Song. Keith developed a relationship with O'Hearn through letters thereafter, and then invited him for an in-person meeting in Ohio State Penitentiary, where he is currently incarcerated. O'Hearn is a witness on Keith's behalf in the court of public opinion, and his foreword is his testimony. As somebody who has enjoyed 6 in-person meetings with Keith, I myself can attest to O'Hearn's statement that he is, quote, one of the most engaging men you will ever talk to, unquote. O'Hearn emphasizes Keith's keen memory, his great appetite for reading, and his unique and beautiful voice as a speaker and writer. He also notes that although Keith has suffered great harms from the American carceral system, he refuses to see himself as a victim in any fundamental way. He is a resilient and morally focused leader of himself and those close to him. If the state of Ohio executes Keith, it will not only murder a precious, innocent person, it will also deprive itself and the world generally of a precious man of great moral character, bravery, and intellect. O'Hearn's foreword also foreshadows a paramount theme of Condemned. Whether we want to admit it or not, America is a plutocracy. A plutocracy is a country run by and mostly for wealthy people, while poor and working people suffer profound harm. This defect in our moral character implies that rich defendants can afford the full protections granted to them by our Constitution. Meanwhile, however, those who cannot afford good legal representation are effectively denied the full power of their constitutional protections. Like so many people ensnared in the American carceral system, Keith comes from poverty, and so his self-defense has been severely disadvantaged from the start. O'Hearn concludes his foreword with a simple, painful rhetorical question. He asks, have we not gone astray somewhere, sometime? In Chapter 1, Lucasville, A Brief History, Keith describes the sociological context in which the Lucasville prison riot took place. He acknowledges the economic despair that many poor and working people in Ohio of all races lived under at the time. You might be familiar, Governor Dewine, with what is referred to as the Southern Strategy of President Richard Nixon. As has tragically always been the case in America, poor and working people are often pitted against each other when they are unable to find unity to challenge their shared oppressor, the plutocracy. Keith observes that just before the riot, the animosity of poor and working white Ohioans was inflamed against poor and working Ohioans of color. In the early years of his imprisonment, Keith observed many white prison guards, none of them wealthy people, with racist tattoos, and heard many of them use the N-word frequently. Some of the white guards and inmates alike were Nazi sympathizers. Some of his fellow prisoners were members of a white supremacist organization known as the Aryan Brotherhood. In so-called polite society outside of the prison, there might not have been so much overt racism. However, the latent racist animosity of many Ohioans was exemplified by their popular support for harsh criminal justice policy. This was tragically exacerbated when, in 1989, a black man was not given the death penalty for murdering a white woman named Beverly Taylor, though he was convicted for the crime. Keith argues that the warden of Ohio prisons at the time, Arthur Tate, was pressured by white constituents in the grips of racialized bigotry to be more brutal to prisoners, especially black prisoners and prisoners of color, in the wake of this killing. Tate wanted to build a supermax prison, but was met with political obstacles by the state government. To overcome this political resistance, Tate devised a way to foment chaotic violence in the Lucasville prison. He planned to force the Sunni Muslim inmates to take a tuberculosis test that they did not want to take for religious reasons. As we will see in the next chapter, the inmates rioted in reaction to this forced tuberculosis test and many other pointless, brutal policies referred to as Operation Shakedown. Chapter 2, April 11th, 1993, day of the uprising, begins with Keith's account of the original reason for his imprisonment. It is important for me to note that this is not the crime for which the state of Ohio plans to execute Keith. Growing up in a very impoverished part of Cleveland, Keith got caught in the throes of the crack epidemic and began selling drugs as a teenager. A former classmate of his, meanwhile, had developed a crack addiction. This classmate and a few other teenagers attacked him one evening. A shootout ensued. In self-defense, Keith shot his former classmate and also suffered 2 gunshot wounds himself. Unfortunately, Keith's former classmate died that night in the hospital bed next to him, where he was treated for his wounds. Keith says rightly that although he had taken someone's life, he was not a killer. He had committed this act in self-defense, not out of vicious sadism. However, the jury still found him guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to 18 years to life in 1989 at 19 years old. Shortly after he was imprisoned, he realized the fragility of his life and began a process of restorative personal growth. He read voraciously and eventually got his GED in prison. He was determined to make something of himself and make his life meaningful, flawed as his actions were at a young age. We now turn to Keith's memory of the day of the uprising itself. Oddly enough, it was Easter Sunday, April 11th, 1993. For him, it was a day like any other in prison. He was allowed 2 hours of exercise on the prison yard from 12:30 p.m. until 2:30 p.m. In the middle of that day's session, a guard suddenly appeared running out of the building with a bloodied head and a masked, armed inmate chasing him. "We're taking over," the inmate exclaimed, to the shock of Keith and the other inmates around him. They came to learn that the group of Sunni Muslims who had objected to the tuberculosis test had had enough. Somehow or another, they had succeeded in seizing control of the interior of the prison from the guards. As other rioters came outside, Keith and the other inmates learned that chaos had broken loose within. They learned that cells were being looted by the rioters. Keith went back inside to try to secure his only worldly possessions from his cell, having no idea how much this reasonable decision would cost him later. Keith was greeted by an absolute pandemonium of broken glass, violence, and small fires inside. He found an inmate labeled as a snitch by the rioters in his cell. Intent on retrieving his possessions, he went to the control panel for the gates of the cells and tried to open his cell, but accidentally opened other cells, setting some of the imprisoned snitches free. One of the rioters threatened that he'd better leave or join the riot. He decided to protect himself and returned to the yard. Preposterously, the prosecution would later assert that he was the instigator of their murderous rampage that had ensued from the riot. Even though he had only been inside for 10 minutes, wanted none of their trouble, had only returned to retrieve his possessions and had already taken the tuberculosis test days earlier. He was not a Sunni Muslim and therefore did not share their religious objections to it. He and the other inmates waited outside with great concern for hours. Eventually, as it started to grow dark, the Ohio State and Highway Patrol and the National Guard began to arrive by helicopters. As evening set in and as the prisoners in the yard started to discuss their concerns that the officers might attack them, an inmate brought a dead body outside. Though Keith did not recognize him, this was yet another moment of shock and concern. While the troops did not move to contain the riot, rioters continued to dump more bodies outside in the yard. The inmates began to separate themselves by race as tensions rose and the evening got colder. The boxing ring that Keith had felt great relief training on was scrapped and turned into bonfires. After an inexplicable delay of several hours, the troops rescued the inmates by ordering them at gunpoint to go into the K-block gymnasium of the prison. They were then ordered to strip naked. Their hands were tied behind their backs, and they were marched into groups of 10 people in cells meant for one person. They stood naked for 5 hours until they were finally given jumpsuits. They were given their first meal, if you want to call it that, 19 hours later, when guards threw several sandwiches into the cell. One volatile inmate, William Bowling, had tried to bully the other inmates in the cell earlier. When they received the sandwiches, William took more than his fair share. Another inmate, Dennis Weaver, challenged him. William lost control of his spirit, grabbed Dennis by the neck, and strangled him to death as 2 other inmates held his legs. A full 30 minutes after Dennis was killed, the guards finally removed the body. The stench of the body's evacuated bowels had invaded the space. Later in Keith's trial, the prosecution developed the narrative that Keith had somehow made William kill Dennis, and that Keith had made the other killers kill the other victims. William and the other witnesses testified accordingly. The prosecution even asked Keith why he hadn't tried to stop the murder of Dennis. This is an absurdly arrogant and ignorant question. There might, in some abstract sense, be a moral answer to the question of whether that would have been the right thing to do. However, we should not ignore the rhetorical smugness of the prosecutor's question. Very few of us have been tortured the way those men were, and so we cannot judge those who have with any self-righteousness, nor can we possibly confer such a terrible punishment as the death penalty upon them. Keith himself says that while that might have been the right thing to do, the rule of imprisonment is to mind your own business. The prosecution would later claim that Keith was mad at the snitches for fomenting the riot they had no stake in. The prosecution would later claim that Keith was mad at the snitches for fomenting the riot that he had no stake in, and so, in the 10 minutes in which he was inside trying to retrieve his things, he somehow compelled the rioters to commit the 9 murders that took place on that day. I wish I could explain what the state is even trying to see here, but it is nonsensical on its face. Keith concludes chapter 2 with this crucial statement: "My aim is merely to present the facts and let you, the public, decide whether or not I deserve to die. Since it will be in your name that my murder, should it occur, will be carried out, you should know the truth. And my hope is that the truth will set you free to demand that justice be done. Please keep reading." Please heed this call to his reader as if it were meant for you in particular, Governor Dewine. You are arguably the most powerful representative of the public in the state of Ohio. Your decision to either grant Keith clemency or refuse to do so, and thus be complicit in his murder, should be a matter of utmost importance to you personally and to the people of conscience in Ohio whom you represent. Chapter 3, Investigation, A Search for Informants, begins with Keith's account of the continued torture to which the inmates were subjected. After they were taken out of the cell where Dennis was killed, 7 of them were moved into another cell that was, quote, no larger than a closet, unquote, for 8 days. The cell lacked a toilet, a sink, or a bed. They obviously could not keep themselves clean and had to defecate into a hole in the center of the floor that could only be flushed by the guards outside. The snickering guards routinely refused to do so. Unsurprisingly, under that pressure, some of the inmates chose to become informants. They were moved to another prison nicknamed the Snitch Academy, where they were given special treatment. They participated in boardroom-style meetings to familiarize themselves and each other with the claims they were supposed to make. In return, they were provided with numerous special affordances, such as free movement between their cells, food, candy, and cigarettes, and most tellingly, a Thanksgiving dinner with prosecutor Mark Piepmeyer. The informants came to be known as Piepmeyer's family. Though Keith does not know for sure, he believes that he was cast as the gang leader by the prosecution as a way of laundering the image of the actual gang leader to the jury. The actual gang leader, Anthony Lavelle, was tasked by the prosecution to testify against Sunni Muslims and members of the Aryan Brotherhood in their respective trials. They blamed his actions as the gang leader on Keith in exchange for this testimony. On page 28, Keith notes that shockingly, he would ultimately be convicted of murdering somebody that another inmate, Daryl DePina, later admitted to murdering. After the aforementioned 8 more days of torture, Keith and the other men with whom he shared a cell for one person were moved to normal prison quarters. Shortly after that, Keith learned that he was being tried for the murder of the 9 men that had died during the riot. Keith was understandably shocked, angered, and gravely concerned. But again, as Dennis O'Hearn wrote in his foreword, Keith does not see himself as a victim. He was determined to abide by a radical self-respect and commitment to the truth of his life and moral purpose. After reading several authors in the civil rights tradition, he changed his name to Bomani Hondo Shakur, which are African names that translate to mighty soldier, prepared for war, the thankful. We come to the final chapter of Condemned we will be reviewing today, Chapter 4, Trial, A Mockery of Justice. Again, the title alone recalls O'Hearn's painfully true statement that American society has gone astray somewhere, sometime. The state insultingly offered him a plea deal, which would have likely resulted in decades more of imprisonment or even a life sentence. Though he admits he considered accepting it, Keith rejected this offer. As he says on page 38, a deal is not a deal when you're asked to forfeit the rest of your life for something you didn't do. In addition, he was tired of, as he puts it, copping out. He says on page 40, I had been copping out my whole life. He had copped out on himself, his friends and family, and his community in earlier stages of his life, and he refused to do so any longer. As the trial began, Keith was confronted with even more examples of the racism that had so corrupted the American justice system. His trial was moved to Ironton, a 93.3% white town. Only 2 of 50 potential jurors for his trial were black, and they were spuriously removed from consideration. In a moment of grotesque irony, the state asked one of the black potential jurors what she thought of the Christian commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." Because she concluded rightly that this commandment renders capital punishment fundamentally immoral, she was removed from consideration. Keith asserts that removing these 2 jurors was illegal based on the trial Batson v. Kentucky, 476 U.S. 79. Keith also outlines general misconduct by the court in this chapter. In October of 1994, Keith's attorneys filed a motion to compel exculpatory evidence. Absurdly, the prosecution argued that the motion should be dismissed as all evidence had been provided with a promise of confidentiality. Keith's judge seemed to offer a compromise. He allowed for the names of 43 inmates who had been interviewed by the Ohio State Highway Patrol to be given to the defense. However, the inmates' statements were withheld. Instead, very brief, unhelpful summaries were given to the judge, who proceeded to read them aloud in court until the defense objected. Given the time constraints of the trial, the defense gave up on their push for exculpatory evidence under this unnecessary interference from the judge and prosecution. On pages 45 and 46, Keith lists many facts about the inmates who testified against him that show them to be unreliable witnesses. These include mental illness, opportunism in the competitive environment of the prison, perjury, and evidence of their suspect relationships with prosecutor Piepmeyer and the Piepmeyer family. Ultimately, when Keith took the stand in his trial, he reminded the jury that he had no stake in the riot whatsoever. He was not a Sunni Muslim, had received his tuberculosis test days before the riot, and therefore had no personal interest in their cause. Without good reason, however, the jury found him guilty on all counts. Worse still, the jury ultimately chose the death penalty as his punishment. When he returned to the prison that afternoon, he learned that he had been moved to a cell that was 50 feet away from the electric chair. Though he went to sleep in great despair, he awoke with his determination somehow still intact. He recalled a poem that had helped him steady himself in anguish as a prisoner, and then sat down to write and memorize the statement he would give to the court at his sentencing hearing. Though his beloved grandmother died several weeks later, he resolved to struggle for his life in honor of her. Yet another grotesque example of the racism Keith has faced over the course of this struggle was the massive crowd of white people that had assembled at his sentencing hearing. None of them had been there for the trial. They might as well have assembled to witness a lynching in the town square. However, Keith spoke his piece to all who were assembled. He claimed that he, quote, stood unbowed and unbroken by what had been allowed to transpire in those walls. He eloquently articulated the inversion of the moral situation the court found itself in. He said, "The only thing I am guilty of is being innocent. And once again, a man is being made to pay for the arrogant insensibility of a people who are so intoxicated by their myths that they don't realize their so-called dream has turned into a nightmare." Most importantly, he recalled the prosecution's claim that every man must be held accountable for what he has done. Because Keith had not committed the crimes for which he had been sentenced to death, he refused to be held accountable for it in his heart. he reaffirmed his faith in God and stated that ultimately his soul was, quote, not governed by man-made laws or the laws that left him to live with death his whole life, unquote. Keith's speech reminds me of the apology of Socrates for its eloquence and moral courage in the face of catastrophic judicial corruption. I call on you, Governor Dewine, to ensure that his fate is not the same as that of the ancient philosopher. This concludes my review of the first 4 chapters of Keith's autobiography, Condemned. I will review the next 3 chapters in my letter to you for next week. Though I will do my very best to do it justice, no review of the book could possibly be superior to the book itself. I encourage you, Governor Dewine, to read the book. I imagine that you will agree with some aspects of his worldview, and that you will disagree with others. However, no one should be imprisoned or executed for their beliefs alone. Please pay attention to the sound logic and rigorous account he provides for his innocence. Though there is much outside of this work that will corroborate his argument, he makes an outstanding case for himself on his own. You will not need to agree with everything he believes to see the fundamental moral truth that you should grant him full clemency and set him free. In my first letter to you, I discussed your stated intention, according to an article published in Cleveland.com on December 15th, 2025, to publish a public statement about your views on the death penalty in January of 2026. Though you have not yet released this statement, it is part of the public record that you seem to have significant moral opposition to the practice. I would like to call your attention to a guest column published in USA Today on January 13th, 2026, by Judge Michael Donnelly, who served in the Ohio Supreme Court from 2019 until 2024. Judge Donnelly holds that as governor of Ohio, your ability to grant clemency is, quote, neither ceremonial nor extraordinary. It is a core feature of our system of checks and balances, preserved to ensure that justice does not end because judicial review has run its course, unquote. He notes, too, that, quote, capital punishment is unique in its severity and finality, unquote. Finally, he notes the obvious fact that no human system is infallible. I hope you remember the numerous fallibilities we have reviewed today in Keith's case, and I urge you to, as Keith says, keep reading about them more with me. Governor Dewine, you have, to use Judge Donnelly's phrase, a duty to act with care. I pray that you do so for Keith, for all death row inmates, and for any person for whom your role as governor might allow you to help them out of brutal carceral violence. Please, Governor, do the right thing. Set Keith LaMar free. Sincerely, David Roush. Do the right thing, Governor.